Jamie Wheal is the executive director of the Flow Genome Project and a leading expert in the neurophysiology of human performance. The Flow Genome Project is arguably the most comprehensive flow state training protocol I've come across, and the ideas behind this project were represented in Wheal's best-selling book, Stealing Fire, which he co-authored with journalist Steven Kotler, who had previously written The Rise of Superman. So all books of a similar stripe. And Stealing Fire looked at four forces: psychology, neurobiology, technology, and pharmacology as means for expediting the pathways to optimal performance, pulling wisdom from world-class athletes, Navy SEALs, and high-performing tech executives to push forward new rituals. I initially learned of Wheal's work through this book, as flow states have defined a lot of my own work over the last decade, first running a music, movement, and neuroscience training program for Equinox Fitness for 2 years, and more recently with my work at Centered, which is a flow state app. As Jamie and I discuss early in our conversation, the groundbreaking work of Hungarian-American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who coined the term flow state in 1975, has been molded to fit into numerous disciplines, which often has diluted the meaning of the term, although Csikszentmihalyi himself recognized that people in every discipline could achieve flow. So when I heard that Jamie's forthcoming book, Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World That's Lost Its Mind, focused on and evolved the themes from Stealing Fire, I wanted to chat with him. There's a lot of crossover in our work. Psychedelics, music, breathwork, religion, sex, something that, as we discuss, is truly problematic in terms of America's squeamishness and outright immaturity around it. Now, in the book, Jamie puts forward the possibility of building an ethical cult. And during the first half of our talk, we lay the groundwork and the principles, but it is in the second half that we discuss what an ethical cult actually means and what it would entail. And as you'll hear, he's definitely more optimistic that such an endeavor is possible. And to his credit, he recognizes the challenges anyone would face in attempting such a construction. I'm not quite as optimistic, but the principles are sound. We just have to see if they can actually scale. But along the way, there are many points we connect on, and that makes such a conversation worth exploring. The reality is that the way we've been chugging along, we meaning American society and arguably a lot of other societies, being constantly distracted, overworked, not connecting, overstressed, unable to get into flow as often as we'd like, if ever, well, these need to be addressed. And the ways that Jamie and I connect with ourselves certainly intersect. And it was a pleasure to chat with someone who knows both the value of deep work and focus, and also strives for the humility and knowledge you acquire when you let go during ritual. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jamie Wheal, and afterwards, Matthew, Julian, and myself will discuss the topics that were brought up during our talk. In Stealing Fire was such a focus on flow states and how you can use the tools that high performers have used for success in their lives or in their careers. And in some ways, this seems like an extension to that, although it goes well beyond flow states. You're still going for that sense of flow in so many ways, and you do reference it. But between the two books, what made you want to focus on creating a toolkit for people to recapture the rapture?
Yeah, and in fact, even Stealing Fire, right? I had collaborated with my co-author on his prior book, Rise of Superman, which was explicitly flow states and peak performance. And then when it came time to write Stealing Fire, which was very much my sort of love letter to my own study and learning about this kind of wild transformational culture that sort of forever seemed to be just kind of underneath the surface, but seemed like it was becoming more and more visible. I was like, I do not want to get parked in the flow state ghetto. You either end up stretching the term beyond Csikszentmihalyi's original academic definitions to fit all the other peak states and non-ordinary states you want to talk about, to a point where you're distorting the concept beyond its helpfulness, or you create the bigger bucket, and in searching for terms that didn't have baggage, that didn't have connotations, that kind of thing, I sort of defaulted back to the ancient Greeks by way of Tom Wolfe. But I hadn't even remembered that Tom Wolfe used this in electrocorrelated acid test to talk about Ken Kesey and the pranksters, but he presents the term ecstasis. I hadn't read it since college. I gave it to my son to read in high school, and he's like, "Dad, get a load of this. Here's ecstasis. Here's these giant domes, with strobe lights and gymnastics equipment." He's like, all you're doing is just totally repeating that. And I was like, holy shit, I hadn't read in 20 years. I totally forgot. But so that was the deliberate introduction of the term ecstasis as a relatively fresh, baggage-free term. We could then kind of decide, name it as positive, non-ordinary states of consciousness. And then in Stealing Fire, I looked back and I was like, well, wait, nominally, that was a book about peak states. But if you look at all the examples as to why we said peak states might be valuable or helpful or worthwhile, there was some inspiration and innovation, right? This is kind of what you actually glean in the state itself. But there were also two very other clear buckets, which was healing and connection. And so then I realized, oh, wow, this whole time, it wasn't a single category, ecstasis. It was actually a triangle. It was ecstasis, the peak state, plus catharsis, the resolution of trauma or integration or growth, plus communitas, the deep kind of shared presence we can get when we co-create or co-participate in those states. So that was kind of the sort of the bridge and what felt like a more fully dimensioned representation of kind of the lived experience of it all.
Now, even Csikszentmihalyi knew that it was applicable across a wide range. His original research from the first 15 years of studies before the flow was published, he interviewed a range of people for that purpose. And then he even went on to apply it to business, as in Good Business, his book, and trying to understand its mechanisms. But I agree with you that a lot of people have co-opted it and tried to just fit it into their own paradigm because it's something that is out there. Obviously, I think a lot about this term. I worked specifically in a program I ran for Equinox Fitness on flow states for 2 years in music, in relationship to neuroscience and music. And then with my current work at Centered with creating technologies for it. But one thing that I think about a lot in terms of flow states and that peak experience is how can you help people to attain that, think content free of their passion and why they're doing it, but in an age where we're inundated with information from social media and constantly being plugged in? Do you see a paradox there that in a time where there's information all the time, it becomes even harder to reach flow states in some capacities?
Well, yeah. I mean, and I think there's so many challenges with where we are right now. And one of them is the sort of quick fix, singular solutions, whether that's flow states or biohacking or meditation, fill in the blank, right? All tools for personal growth and development have been poured into the quick fix, new thought, info marketing bucket, which is just a sort of cesspool of failed expectations and delivery. And fundamentally, I think a false assumption about what a fully dimensioned life actually looks like, which is, and I think this is true of the psychedelic renaissance and, all of the truth claims around that, which is just none of this gets us off the hook for figuring out the human condition. I mean, we can expand the canvas, we can paint with brighter colors, we can do anything we want, but it all boils down, like the weak link is not our access to transcendent states. The weak link is Monday morning. It's the dishes. It's the kid who won't sleep through the night. It's can I make rent? Like that's the weak link in the human condition. And oh, by the way, and what are 8 billion of my brothers and sisters doing as well? And can we pull this thing off? So and then. Quite recently, it feels like, obviously the last 10, but really ramping and accelerating strongly in the last 5 is what I've been sort of loosely calling like the Ice 9 effect, from Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, right? So folks who aren't familiar with that story, there's, a military clandestine operation to create Ice 9, which turns all the water molecules on the planet to ice, instantly basically ending life. And my sense is that there is a sort of a digital narcissism version of Ice 9 now. And so if you take some of the strongest, most potent ways for us to get beyond ourselves, and just take 3 examples like Burning Man, Peruvian ayahuascan shaman dive in the jungle, and like wild nature, crazy peaks, beautiful hot springs in the backcountry, et cetera. They've all been co-opted by the capacity for somebody to have a truly ego-dissolving, awe-filled, transcendent experience, and then just out of habit or custom or transactional, desire, they're on their phone posting almost instantly about that ego-dissolving experience they just had. And maybe they're geotagging it, maybe they're inviting you for their weekend workshop, maybe whatever, And so when you see that, where you're like literally in the furthest, most extreme, most intense ends of the earth, our capacity to loop it back into self as selfie, digital narcissism, representational realities, I'm staggered and somewhat horrified, because there's literally nowhere else to go. Like, this is as good as we got, friends, and if Ice 9 is catching us as fast as we're trying to run away from ourselves, then we're in a different kind of pickle.
I want to get into some of the chapters specifically for the what you present as pieces of the toolkit, and then go into the overall toolkit. But one thing you write is, for a species that seems to forever trip over our own sense of importance, which you just referenced, a healthy dose of awe, wonder, and humility could be good for what ails us. So let's start with awe. What is your go-to to inject awe into Monday morning?
Well, I'm not very good at injecting awe into Monday mornings. Maybe a cup of good coffee. No, but I would say, but what I'm doing between Friday at 5 and Monday morning would have a lot to do with it. For me, the absolute go-tos is basically like music, mountains, mushrooms, and marriage. By marriage, you could just say long, like dedicated dyadic partnership, quite likely with a physical, erotic, intimate connection, right? Music speaks for itself. There is no replacement for the capacity and power of both the beat and the groove, and then potentially the lyrics, to unlock in us things that are primal and profound and can pick our asses broken off the floor and dancing again. And I think it's such a commodity, it's so ubiquitous, that we sort of miss the ancient and timeless power of that. And then, fundamentally, yes, for sure, psychedelics are awesome within reason. I mean, I think the worst people are doing the best drugs these days. Right, where all the sort of crawl up your own asshole and endless personal growth, self-absorbed, fill in the blank salty word that was about to come out of my mouth, and they end up just in these sensation-seeking loops of becoming sort of bliss junkies and epiphany whores. Versus, could we get those substances to nurses, first responders, teachers, right? The people who are in service already to something bigger and greater than themselves. They're getting the shit kicked out of them, but they're dedicated to the cause, and they really need places to defrag their nervous systems, to reboot, to reconnect to their purpose, their inspiration, etc. And big nature. I mean, I think a pretty simple lad at heart. I mean, I love gravity sports in beautiful, wild locations, natural hot springs. You combine these things. You're like, let's go to festivals and have beautiful, communitas release. Like, there we are dancing with our tribe. Like, that's gorgeous, right? And then combine psychedelics with beautiful nature and or action sports, and have your, special friend with benefits to explore the both, intimacy, but also potency of couples union. And that covers an awful lot of bases, at least from where I sit.
Well, yeah, I mean, it covers many bases, and all the bases that I love. And let's take them one by one. So let's going to psychedelics. I've been using them since 1994. I've been an advocate for responsible use, and which is becoming more challenging. It's something I find we're going to be covering more on this podcast because there are abuses in there. But one thing that you referenced that made me very happy was pointing out, and this is something I've gotten a lot of pushback for, was that the antidepressant crisis is as relevant as the opioid crisis. And I don't think that people understand the clinical trials that made Xanax approved for FDA usage, for example. There's a lot of baggage that comes with all of this. So as we start to talk a little more about psychedelics now, what made you want to include that about antidepressants in the current ways we treat mental health protocols in this country?
Well, I think in that instance, it was just that it was part of the larger point that we've had this erosion in trustworthy authority, including even, your friendly family physician. And that family physician has been prescribing your kids amphetamines as their brains are knitting together in the form of Ritalin and Adderall. It's like high strength amphetamines, just speed. And it sometimes makes your kids sit still longer or study better, but just bunging at them. And then, most folks are familiar with Prozac Nation and SSRIs as the antidepressants, but benzodiazepines are that's the Xanaxes, the Klonopins, that's the ones that took out Jordan Peterson. And we actually have a dear friend whose wife was debilitated for years as a result of iatrogenic illness, which just means they were fine, and then the doctor told them to do something or did something to them, and then they were much, much worse. And that is a massive, pervasive, and significantly underreported issue. So just in general, to say that, we used, I think the old Andy Griffith, and I don't even remember who the dude was in the 50s with the black bag, he used to make the house calls, but like that notion, right, compared to like managed health, pharmaceutical company, high pressure sales, Purdue Pharma and all the various players. I think McKinsey just got popped, I think, actually, for a significant fine, like tens of millions, potentially hundreds, on having helped Purdue Pharma continue to market OxyContin well after the opioid epidemic was in place, established, and causes were known. So you're just like, hell, man, this is just important, especially in a book where I was going to say, hey, let's take a clear-eyed look at the toolkit of inspiration and healing. And there's no way we can talk about respiration, music, embodiment, sexuality, substances. We can't talk about these things without culturally loaded judgment. And so which lens are we wearing? We're either a hedonist, a purist, or a conformist. And the hedonists are all about it. They're like, bring it on. And they probably need, slowing down and some structure. But the purists and conformists are often quite judgy. And that sense of when you're talking about these things, they're potentially taboo topics, but it's not they're bad, that's why they're taboo. It's they're potent, that's why they're taboo, right? They have to be controlled by a social structure, or you don't get a civilization that's manageable. So when we broach the topics, you're going to trigger everybody's latent social conditioning, or the lens through which they look at things. And particularly for conformist. I mean, we live here in Austin, Texas, which is kind of it's almost like a thermocline. Like you've got super hip, progressive, edgy culture, and then you've also got kind of surprisingly buttoned down, fairly traditional culture. And the number of times that we'll go to parties and, people think nothing of knocking back 4 to 6 drinks of alcohol. But, if you're the one, in the Tony part of town to bust out a joint at a party, whoa, things are getting a little edgy. Or
now that happens there?
I mean, and we clearly don't self-select for the stodgiest bunch, and yet it's actually staggeringly stodgy in circles that you wouldn't think otherwise. And then the same thing, their kids could be on Ritalin. We were at one dinner party where we were literally the only couple that wasn't both using Ambien to go to sleep. And I was like, what? That's crazy. Do you understand what Ambien is? Like, it's this mutant chemical structure, has all kinds of strange side effects. And, and then going into marital conflicts. And I'd be talking with friends and I'd be like, dude, if you guys could just, I can help connect you to the appropriate therapists. You guys could do some MDMA couples therapy together. It could be game changing. Because like these weren't, and this is like half a dozen divorces in the 40s, kind of all clockwork textbook shit. But the thing that struck me was none of them were from a cataclysmic life event. Not bankruptcy, not infidelity, not addiction, definitely not money issues. It was just the accretion of frustration of midlife. And in this particular tiny sample size, it was all the women saying, fuck this, I'm burning it all down. And they would sign up for couples therapy because that's what someone who's trying to work on the marriage does. But it was all optics. And yet they would reject doing something that, that book, Love Drugs, which is an Oxford ethicist and a Yale ethicist making the case for, right, pharmacological support for relationships, basically oxytocin, MDMA, other kind of compounds. And they would, turn their nose up at all of those things, either healthier recreational substances for intoxication, cleaner ways for their kids to ground themselves, be embodied, and be able to focus, ways for them to get to sleep at night, or even ways for them to save their entire marriage and family. And those were all considered other, but the things that they accepted because somebody with a lab coat wrote a script for it, or it was socially endorsed and normed, there just seemed to be very little evidence-based or experience-based discernment between what we do and why.
And Ambien has been shown to only add an extra 8 to 11 minutes of sleep a night. So even the fact that all the problems it has with your theta waves, and then it only adds that and makes you, we can let's not go that way because I could talk for hours about that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned getting psychedelics to the nurses, for example, and getting it to more people, which I fully agree with in the right circumstances. What, from your perspective in this toolkit, would psychedelics offer them to help them have a sense of awe and humility, perhaps?
Well, I mean, the simplest is it is, programmable transcendence on demand, right? To kind of paraphrase Oliver Sacks, right? You can set aside a time, a location, a place. You can create an environment. You can program that with music, with light, with whatever you want to as far as your interior experience, and you can have a reliable reboot. Now, there's obviously wide variation across different classes and categories of what kind of gets bundled as psychedelics, but it typically, the Latin definition of ecstasis is to step outside oneself, right? And so it's really, as much as anything else, it's a momentary time to to basically unzip the monkey suit of my waking, socially defined self and step out into something more free, more expressive, potentially more inspired, perhaps more true, more authentic, right? Any of those things. And just get to feel that for a moment to a few hours. And Carl Diceroth, actually, at Stanford, has just published a paper in Nature at the end of last year, and it was specifically about, his study was with ketamine, and it was with epileptic patients and mice. So he's doing two different populations, but apparently you can determine when mice are in the K-hole, right? So they were zapping them both. I mean, I think they just do goofy shit and don't navigate mazes very well, is my assumption. But they're like, oh, you're tripping balls. So they studied them both, and they found that they were really trying to zero in on the dissociative experience. So literally the experience of stepping outside yourself, and what role did it play in antidepressant? So did the getting outside yourself actually play a part versus like just the pure neurochemistry of glutamate receptors and other kind of just chemical stimulation things? And their conclusion was that it did. And then they did something else that was interesting, which was they did EEG tracking on the human subjects and found that their brain waves, while in a deep ketamine state, were right around 3 hertz, which is extremely low, right? 0 hertz is brain dead, and 1 to 4 hertz is basically the delta band of EEG activity. And that is far beneath anything. You reference theta, that's a click up. Then there's alpha, which is often meditative and flow-like states, and then there's beta, where we are all most of the time. So a potential benefit of psychedelic states is that they can shift our set points. They can expand our neurophysiological kind of Overton window, right? From locked into 21st century normal, tired, wired, stressed, hyperactive prefrontal cortex, executive function, inner critic, very accelerated beta wave activity, typically stress arousal responses, so sympathetic engagement, norepinephrine, cortisol, all the kind of things that are good to run away from the proverbial saber-toothed tiger and very bad to be still feeling at 3 a.m. as you're rehashing the conversation with your boss or the flame war on social media, right? And what Diceroth found at Stanford that I think is critical, because it gets us out of the judgy mechanism conversation. Like, oh, that's just sexuality, or oh, that's drug use, or oh, that's the other. Is that when he tracked the 3 hertz, they then went back in and neurostimulated, so electrically stimulated specific brain regions in the human subjects and optogenetically tweaked it in the mice, and then put them back into the same 3 hertz state without the ketamine. And that 3 hertz state produced the same sense of disembodiment and the same positive return on depression. So you're like, so now this gets super interesting, right? And then you're like, okay, delta waves, this is interesting. Typically, that's deep dreamless sleep. And so you can access that through, crazy ass lucid dreaming protocols, some super esoteric Dzogchen, Tibetan meditation stuff. But in general, no one knows much about that space. Most sleep researchers are really interested in REM sleep and dreaming. Most waking state folks are interested in kind of beta to alpha theta. Maybe they geek on gamma bursts and this and that. But like waking delta, there's virtually nothing out there that highlights it or signposts to it. And then you're like, okay, so ketamine does it. You look at this, there was a team of anesthesiologists at MIT that did a fascinating paper, I think it was in 2015, where they had found that under the influence of 50% oxygen, 50% nitrous oxide, that patients were going into waking delta wave activity with double amplitude cycles. And they're like, hey, this molecule has an impact on the nervous system that no other known substance does, and is putting people into 3 to 12 minutes of this double amplitude delta before their brains adapt and normalize and it goes away. But they're like, holy shit, what's that? And then I've seen a recent radar plot on 5-MeO DMT studies, and the same thing for like literally as 5-MeO hits, you get completely like cross-hemispheric full saturation, like the entire crown of someone's head. The radar plot looks down on the top of your skull and kind of maps what parts of your brain are lighting up, just all peak orange, like just like synchronous delta. And then you juxtapose that against the subjective reports that people have in those states underneath those, under the influence of those compounds. And it's consistently balls to the wall, information rich, super inspiring, often, profoundly life-shaping and altering. And you're like, okay, now for all of us that have kind of signed up for this mortal coil and are trying to figure out, how do I maintain my hope, my inspiration, my enthusiasm when, many, many things in life are just kicking the shit out of me. The ability to step outside ourselves, the ability to healthily dissociate for a moment, and then potentially connect to whatever accelerated or deeper information layer appears to be apprehendable in that zone of neuroelectric activity. Isn't that something that we would want for people to periodically, whether it's rites of passage through a life or whether it's one time a year, we can kind of talk about, the calendaring of these kind of things and how they might fit in a cultured context. But like, my God, don't we all deserve to lay our burdens down for a moment, right? And just go, glory, glory, hallelujah.
That is one of the things with psychedelics specifically, is that, for some people, like the church experiment in the 60s at Harvard, where that one experience had such a profound impact that it was one of the top 5 experiences of their lives. Mm-hmm. But what worries me at this moment is that pharmaceutical companies are dependent on people taking their product daily. Mm-hmm. And there's a rush of money going into the research on psychedelics, which I'm very happy about, but I don't feel that all of it's purely benevolent. They're going to want to see an ROI. So have you pinpointed, or do you feel there are any dangers with the future, not so future now, monetization of these substances? And do you think that's going to skew either the data or the experience for people and the ways that they're presented.
Yeah, I mean, there's an impossible reckoning and reconciliation that I think is going to. I mean, I was about to say it's going to have to happen, but on the other hand, no, it's not. So we'll see, right? But and I've talked with Rick Doblin at MAPS about this, and a number of other kind of thoughtful folks that are dedicated to the fighting the good fight in the psychedelic renaissance. But one, that there are unintended consequences to having pursued the medical, clinical, pharmacological path to access. And one of them is, it's almost like everybody sort of crossed their fingers behind their backs and said, no one talk about the freaky shit. We're going to talk about depression and anxiety and smoking cessation and dosages, and this is all going to be buttoned down and entirely respectable. And then, God bless you, Michael Pollan, you made this accessible to neurotic squares everywhere, right? and I mean, God bless him. I mean, I've quoted Michael Pollan probably more frequently in my career than any other single writer. And at the same time, he did for psychedelics what What's Her Bucket did for 50 Shades of Grey, did for the BSDM community. Like, she was an outsider fantasizing and fetishizing the kink scene, right? And any of the folks who were sort of figureheads in that were like, you've got to be kidding me. She's an interloper, and Pollan did the same thing to the psychedelic community. He was an outsider peering through the plate glass window and then occasionally describing his hesitant steps across that threshold. Right. So the question here is the medicalization model spitting out into venture capital and big pharma has certain almost impossible to beat game theoretic and market mechanics driving it. So we have seen and we will see more of the rush to patent protection, the rush to return on investment, the race to the bottom of what's the best bang for the buck care we can deliver with the highest margin, which is anathema to many of the underground therapists who risked their career and their licensure over the last 30 years to keep psychedelic therapy accessible to people who really needed it, because it was purely what they believed in, and it was typically high touch, highly relational. That there were egregious, abusers in that world as well, but in general, that was a core community. And now you're getting psychedelic novices on the helping professions, functional medicine doctors and psychiatrists and things who have never personally participated in any expression of the psychedelic counterculture, who are literally just coming to this because they read Pollan, or coming to this because they've read the Hopkins or Imperial reviews. And God bless them, they know they're out of bullets. They know that SSRIs and the other element, the tools in their kit, are inadequate. So they're coming to it this way. But they are, opening ketamine therapy clinics, and they're sending people into spaces and places that they have little to no experience of themselves, and then no phenomenological framework whatsoever to help people understand what it is they've just glimpsed. And so that is just a train wreck. And so now you have people, and again, with the pharmacological model, you're talking about how many patient turns can you get in a day? How long do they have to be in your office before you can release them and put someone else in that seat? And then people are talking about integration as if it's, oh yeah. I mean, I even asked a functional med doc here in Austin who's been quite bullish on providing these experiences. I was like, well, what are you doing for integration? He's like, oh, no, don't worry. We got that taped. We do an hour interview beforehand, and we follow up with them the day after. And it was like, holy shit, And so that's where, I think through that model, and we're seeing it with esketamine, the Johnson & Johnson patenting of a slight tweak on the ketamine chemical because it had been patent expired, IP available. So they're like, well, let's tweak it. Let's patent the delivery system, and then we can sell the shit out of that at literally 100x the pricing of compounding pharmacy generic ketamine. The same thing with synthetic cannabinoids. You can grow cannabis anywhere you want, and it's available in 30 plus states, but Epidiolex, is a synthetic cannabis tweak. And once again, you get back to price jacked proprietary trade and protectionism. And, a final one that I think will happen, like without a doubt, we're just going to get Prozac Nation 2.0. Now with new improved 5-HT2A receptors, like that, right? Like that's what will happen. Now, what else happens is up to us, but like that's definitely happening. And so I think we're not going to get as, and then, you take, that's the pharmacological model. On the other side, you've got the religious sacramental model. You've got Native American church, you've got Santo Daime, you've got these other institutions that have, pursued a totally different path, which is religious sanction and approval and protection of, basically religious right to worship and practice. And that's a potentially, I think, a more accurate fit for the ineffability, the awe, the sanctity of what is potentially accessible. However, they're all syncretic faiths stuck in their reality tunnels. So without diminishing respect and appreciation for folks who've come up through those lineages and traditions, for someone on the outside of that who's like, man, I am desperate to have that experience of awe, but in order for me to get to your Kool-Aid, I got to drink your Kool-Aid. And in fact, that includes an entire, from a sort of meta perspective, an epistemological shit show of an amalgamation of beliefs, some of which have to do with the ineffability of the experience, some have to do with syncretic religious mashups over the last 100 years, the peculiarities of a founder, you name it. And so now my experience getting imprinted into the arguably profoundly unique and personal sovereign experience of coming back to myself on this earth or beyond it is now being tainted, by a whole bunch of other people's cultural baggage. So those are some of the tricks and the challenges, and kind of why in this book I was attempting to articulate an operating system that people could apply. So how do you still honor the uniquenesses of different cultures, but include more precise and more accurate meaning-making, protocols or lenses or whatever it would be to help, come up with clearer, cleaner insights with less faulty bugs in the code, I guess.
I want to talk about that, but there's one part in that toolkit that I don't want to overlook, because out of everything you wrote in the chapters leading up to the toolkit, this one was the most profound for me, probably just because all of the other ones have been my life for decades. But the chapters on sex specifically, and this is something that I talk about a lot with my wife, because it's something that she's been interested, like people's hesitancies to even discuss sex openly, how reserved and puritanical we are as a culture. And when you wrote that 2 US labs, there's only 2 that are federally funded for sexual arousal, it seems so strange to me that such a primal component of who we are as beings and as animals would not be studied more. Why do you think at this point we are so hesitant to openly discuss sex? And along with that, why did you include it as a piece of this toolkit that you're putting forward?
Yeah, I mean, like that point that you just mentioned, the kind of almost total marginalization of academic and clinical research on sexuality was something I came across in the research for the writing. I didn't have that one, like I was like, holy shit. And that section literally almost just kind of wrote itself, in large part from featuring Dr. Helen Fisher and Dr. Nicole Prause, who were both researchers at the Kinsey Institute, pretty much one of the preeminent sexuality research centers, and then both kind of had to do these workarounds to how to pursue their career unencumbered. And Helen Fisher took a position as chief scientist at Match.com. Nicole Prause had done her postdocs at Harvard. She was then at UCLA, and she found she could not get through the studies she wanted to do. So she actually set up an independent research lab. And so there's also, there's a whole additional layer of misogyny of like smart women talking about sexuality and what happens to that. And, and do they get clipped in ways that a man may not in the academic field? But it's basically, it's heartbreaking, but it is also unique and peculiar to the United States. So many researchers would go to New Zealand, they go to Australia, they go to Canada, they go to the Netherlands. They pretty much got anywhere out of the US. And I don't think it takes 3 degrees in comparative anthropology to say that the religious right has absolutely fucked this country in the head on everything from environmental care all the way to relationships, to things as straightforward as women's reproductive rights, but then as far-reaching as, unfiltered, healthy sexuality. And so we're just wrestling with, and then, one of the funniest stats I've ever heard is that even in Puritan New England, 17th century, where they would do these whacked things called bundling, like they would take a courting couple in their late teens, and they would bundle them, which is they'd put them in the bed side by side, but they'd strap them down with sheets so they couldn't move. It was almost like a horizontal straitjacket, and that was kind of how you were supposed to get to know your potential spouse. But invariably, passion would take over. And 1 in 3 children in 17th century Puritan New England were born out of wedlock. So you're like, even the Puritans, who are like the standard characters for repressive sexuality, couldn't keep it in their pants.
Well, so you give a framework for leadership in these spaces. And as I said, reading the book, I mean, I'm so on board, and I'm sure if we were in person, we'd have a great weekend together in every capacity with music and psychedelics and all of that. But when I think about my experiences and being a psychedelics advocate from the 90s, when I used to hush and not talk about it very often because of the stigmatization, looking at it more broadly to sort of put forward these lessons in the culture, I think of an organization like MAPS, who is doing wonderful work at their MDMA training and their psilocybin training and what they're trying to create as therapists, which I think it's going to take days for a session. It's not just go and we'll call you tomorrow. But your survey of cultic dynamics, and specifically this idea of building an ethical cult, it seems to rely on charismatic leadership that stays noble and avoids the abuses that are pretty much standard features of cults that we've encountered for a long time. So have we ever seen this sort of work before? And what kind of training would be required for the more comprehensive leadership that you're putting forward?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I also realized I didn't fully answer your question about how come sexuality. So we just talked about the repression part, right? But
okay.
The reason I had to like fall on that sword, I'm like, I think I have to write about this, is because any road you look at, like if you look at the entire field of biohacking, personal optimization, all of that kind of stuff, the core driving central regulators, is our sexual arousal network. And John Lilly discovered that back in like the early 50s, but he's like, holy shit, he was working with rhesus monkeys and stuff. He's like, our ecstatic arousal system maps 1-to-1 with our sexual arousal network. So you're like, okay, so if people are talking about breathe more or stretch more, or it's fascia, or it's this, or it's like, yeah, it's also probably in our healthy, vital arousal cycle. And for any doctor who checks hormone levels and the use it or lose it kind of notion, is like, nothing is a surer path to the grave than involuntary celibacy, right? Just the shutting down of your sexual arousal, right? And when that is alive, when that is thriving, your body's like, yeah, man, things are still happening. We're still going, we're still growing. And then you go back to it. I hadn't connected the dots until I was on a panel with Rick Doblin at MAPS, and we were discussing in between speeches. He's like, yeah, it's several things. He said, A, we're finding better therapeutic impact with 85 milligrams of MDMA instead of 150. So basically, rather than being love bombed with a full serotonin, oxytocin dump, that kind of thing, we're getting more out of working with a therapist when they were just kind of in that threshold space, but still more cognizant, right? Versus just, starry-eyed and drooling. But he said, interestingly, the closest we've found neurophysiologically to that super productive therapeutic state that is helping sufferers of trauma release and relieve it is the post-orgasmic state. High vasopressin, high prolactin, high oxytocin. I was like, oh shit. Like, okay, like how else could we get people to that post-orgasmic state? And then you're like, oh my gosh, what if, and then Nicole Prousey's work, she was starting to study orgasm as prescription pharmaceutical. Like, could it actually replace taking pills? Can it for sleeplessness, for physical pain, for anxiety, for all these things? And you're like, holy smokes. The most ancient, strongly encoded response system we have in our body besides breathing and eating is reproducing. Now, that very fact has caused piles of grief in our collective life, right? Sexual trauma is arguably at the heart of, half or more of all the world's trauma, impact, violence, and suffering. So that's its default condition. But if we could shine the light on it and bring sexual fitness as a tool to cycle through our nervous systems, to discharge stress and trauma, to promote bonding, and to potentially, in its most intentional forms, put us in a super saturated state where inspiration and healing are more accessible without any external substances, that feels like a viable and essential missing link in our cultural toolkit. And we sort of need, I think, to talk about it, bring it into the light of day, tell the story of, human evolution and the central role that sexuality has placed in elevating our consciousness and self-awareness, but also into our daily lives, into our families, into our marriages, into all of these things, so that, sexual fitness can be another uplifting experience. And then you're like, okay, if you look at most indigenous cultures and communities, an awful lot of them, right? Their origin myths aren't some crazy ass story. It's like usually some, apex predators or, key animal totems of their area or some gods began the universe by getting it on. And, and most anthropologists, like Victorian anthropologists, would kind of snicker, like, oh my gosh, these ribald natives, like they're all they ever think about. But you're like, no, it kind of makes sense. And what would it be like for us to be able to bring that re-sanctification and re-honoring it without getting squirrely, without getting, fetishizing it, just being like, yes, of course, this is how the world goes round. And this is how we can reclaim those impulses and energies. And instead of being dancing on the strings of an indifferent evolution that's just looking for a spicy gene pool, never mind what carnage it sows, we can reclaim that system and that powerful force in our lives and deploy it for healing and integration and connection. So that's the thought. And basically, if you pursue this to its end, if you just look at biohacking 101 and you go into like it with an open mind, no preconceptions, and an unwillingness to flinch, you end up in one of two places. You end up with super sexy biohacking or deeply nerdy kink. You just kind of do, right? And that is the end of the road. Like if you're saying, how do we optimize by tweaking and hacking and doing all the things that people like to do these days, you end up with some form of neo-tantric sex magic. But it's not for the faint of heart.
Well, Fraser wrote The Golden Bow as a takedown of uncivilized cultures, and it ended up creating an entire discipline of religious studies. So people will always be fascinated. But bringing that into the question, and thank you for answering, I think I got so caught up in your response about that puritanical sheet ritual that I just kind of lost track because I so fixated on that image. But about the type of training, and then adding to that, like, because we've seen so many abuses specifically around sexual abuse that is over and over, like, we talk about yoga cults all the time, but it's pervasive. This is the part where I think I diverge from you purely in the sense that I don't have as much optimism and hope as you put forward that humans could pull that off. So what type of training is possible to actually pull what you're putting forward off on a scalable level?
I mean, and I wondered about this too, right? Because I've even academically, like in grad school and everything, I studied utopian and visionary movements. I was and indigenous cultures. Like that was kind of I was like basically anything but like mainstream Western civilization. What are our other choices, and who's been experimenting, and how far did it go, and what were the lessons learned? And when most people think of cults, they think of NXIVM, they think of Heaven's Gate, they think of Manson and Jonestown, right? And those are all cautionary tales, and most folks moralize and kind of tut afterwards, and including like the cult experts who deprogram people. It's actually quite a narrow, judgy, incurious, monolithic frame they just put over the whole thing. Like those guys were hucksters, those people were dupes, we need to save them, deprogram them, that kind of thing. It's sort of like the cultic equivalent of AA, just a blunt instrument. But those aren't, to me, the interesting ones. The interesting ones are Osho, Adida, like ones who were absolute wide awake transmitters, and they were prodigies in their early lives, and they were actually absolutely slinging starlight for a while. And then things went pear-shaped. And you're like, okay, what's that about? What happens when somebody truly has talent, truly has prodigious insight, and then something else warps or twists? What is that dynamic that keeps putting it in the ditch? And my sense is that, for lack of a better term, we could kind of call it the Lucifer effect, right? Which is, as an adept starts harnessing ecstatic techniques and technologies, and it could be a yoga practice, it could be a breathwork practice, it could be sexuality, it could be substances, it could be bhakti yoga, it could whatever, right? There's lots of ways to get to God, right? But they're doing it and they're accelerating their own experience. And as they do so, they become more translucent. They become more illumined, right? They are just going off, and they could have the gift of gab and speaking logos like McKenna or Leary. They could have pure transmitting power where people in their physical presence completely feel blown wide open, like Adida did and others have, right? And then at some point, the Lucifer effect kicks in, which is, dare thee to look upon me and spot my imperfection. And because they're so, statistically unusually luminous, most people cow their eyes. Most people say, "Oh my God, that's so bright. I can't even take it all in." And as that, the leader has now denied their own humanity, right? Even if they were 99% done on the God project, right? They got 1% shadow left, right? It can metastasize and come back on sort of effectively Kundalini overdrive, because they're doing all the accelerating practices. They have all the psychic energy of a whole, of a whole community, and they can go from one step away from Bodhisattva into Sith Lord, in the span of a few months. And it feels like the only antidote to that is the kind of Christic archetype versus the Lucifer archetype, which is, my humanity lies at the intersection of my mortality and my divinity. And that's where we commit to meet each other. So that to me is that's the metaphorical antidote. And then the practical ones, we'll get increasingly kind of granular, is, to assume that this is a feature, not a bug, of tribal primates gathering, and that the compulsion or the instinct to focus on an alpha, particularly one who is serving as an enactor or an activator, right? There's the capacity to sort of imprint, like little farm, like the little ducklings on a barnyard pig, like, you're my mommy, like the first time somebody boots you into a higher level of consciousness, you're going to imprint. In psychotherapy, it's the term is transference, right? You're going to be like, and then throw in a bunch more ecstatic technologies than a Freudian couch, and you've got all kinds of, exacerbators. So there's the imprinting notion, there's the tribal primate dynamics to defer to an alpha, and then there's the impulse, which up until now has been nearly irresistible, which is grabbing the ring of power, right? I mean, it's, are you not entertained, and then we get into like that Jungian notion of the golden shadow, right? Which is, as a person in the presence of someone real or imagined who has more attainment, more power, closer access to insight, spirituality, source, whatever the truth claim is, I am typically going to deny for myself what I celebrate or acknowledge in them. So they are awakened, they are compassionate, they are inspired, they are, whatever I could never be. And many leaders in the front of a stage will willingly take that on. They will say, yes, thank you, I deserve it. I'll take your mala beads, I'll take your flowers, I'll take your offerings, I'll take your wife, I'll take your money, I'll take it because I deserve it. And even if they are badass, over time, all of that shadow gold, right, from their community will drop them to their knees, will take their community with them. And so, and I kind of got this insight from a conversation with Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's preeminent neuroscientist. She's one of the top 100 most cited scientist in academia. She's got appointments at Harvard and Northeastern, and she wrote a book called How Emotions Are Made. And it basically undoes, most neuropsychological theory on emotions and everything else. And she's like, hey, we ascribe all fancy pants terms, like I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm anxious, I'm this and that. But really, it's only 4 things. We're either actively engaged or passively retired, and it's either positive or negative. And when I looked at that, I was like, oh, wow, this matches perfectly to people's responses to an avatar, right? To a guru, to someone who is an unusually awake, juiced person. And it's typically, they want to follow them if they, because they're like, that's amazing. And I'm the little barnyard duckling. Or they get their wires crossed and they're like, I've never felt this strongly about someone ever, except maybe other with like romantic, erotic arousal. And if this person is bringing agape, let's say sort of pure, almost androgynous love, right, in that condition, but people have never experienced the feelings that strongly, they've only experienced with a sexual arousal, then they get their wires crossed. And so they don't want to just follow them, they want to fuck them. And then if people get freaked because they're in too deeper waters, they're experiencing the edges of their self-dissolving, family members are like, you're in a cult, come back. Then they start fearing them. That's the passive negative. Or if you get enough critical mass or a strong enough threat to someone's self-system, they want to fight them. They want to crucify them or cancel them. So fear, fight, follow, fuck, right, are our default settings for how do we respond in that situation. And that gives rise to almost all cultic dynamics and many tragic martyr dynamics as well, right? So there's the 5th path, which is what if we can feel? What if we can feel it all? So at an interoceptive level, in the presence of another human, that awakens, engages, or precipitates access to higher states of inspiration or deeper states of healing. Can we actually own it and claim it and feel it without giving away our gold, without doing one of the other 4, right? And actually, hey, you reminded me, I'll turn around, I'll repay the favor, we'll help wake each other up. And once we do, we're all standing on our own 2 feet. And a final thought of that, it was, I think that role of the Hierophant, the role of the minister of the sacred, is so predictably problematic, right? That we actually should treat that, again, as a feature, not a bug. So rather than going, oh, yeah, well, Tony Robbins got a little sideways after things went to his head, but that'll never happen to me. Or that Hillsong minister guy, like he really overcooked, but that'll never happen to us. You're like, no. It happens to everyone. And so my sense is, your question, how do you scale this? How do you train this? I think some of the simplest is we create developmental models. So Bob Keegan at Harvard is a longtime inspiration and mentor, right? He's done an awful lot for how do you design a deliberately developmental organization? And he's done fascinating work on this. He's worked with lots of big organizations, public, private, nonprofits everywhere. And the idea is, how do you create a community, right, around a shared mission or goal, who's beyond that specific real world commitment, its goal is to help the people inside the organization develop from socially defined, meaning I'm living out the scripts that were handed to me of husband, mother, brother, Christian, Muslim, Jew, whatever it would be, banker, you name it, but socially defined scripts, to becoming a self-authoring human where I'm writing my own story, and potentially even a self-transforming person who can continue going through my stages of growth. And a way to do that, obviously in conventional organizations, there's plenty of structures and boundaries, and you just kind of would pour that concept in. But if we're talking about transformational culture, some form of postmodern religiosity or spirituality, those kind of things, I think another piece is you treat the Hierophant like you would somebody like a worker at a nuclear power plant. You'd literally almost have the equivalent of a Geiger counter, So it's like, okay, it's your turn on stage this week. Right? You're going to be the Hierophant. You're going to administer this ecstatic, cathartic community experience. And then bing, 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 you need to go in the back and wash dishes for a while. Like, you're not that special, right? And potentially even, because the thing, if you think of Cirque du Soleil, right? No one follows the ringmaster home. thinking that they're a demigod. They understand that they put on a top hat, they put on tails, they're the MC, they are the facilitator of the magic, but they themselves are not a wizard. And I think that ideally what I would love to see would be like male and female dyads facilitating, and potentially, and that's a rotating cast of characters, so that you're constantly dumping the target. You're not creating cults of personality. And you could even, back to Frasier and the Golden Bow and those kind of things, and like European celebrations of the stag and, the stag and the prince, the queen and those kind of things. You could even have them be in costume, maybe even in mask, in role, in a sort of archetypal theatrical presentation. And then if you come back the next week, let's say we're talking nominally about like some form of like service, or initiation. You come back the next time and it's the same characters, different people playing them. And so baked into the social structuring, you're constantly reminding people it's not about any one of us, it's about all of us. And the goal is not to give your gold and follow. Your goal is to claim your gold and then turn around and help the next person.
I have no doubt that there are benevolent leaders. I believe I studied under probably the only yoga teacher that I would say reached guru status, but was completely selfless. His name was Dharma Mitra in New York. And the funny thing about it is, though, the people I've come across in the past that are selfless, they're not marketing themselves. And so they make them a little bit harder to find. And the role of, I'm glad you brought up Osho, because that's a good example of someone who I know people to this day still cling to his words. And I had written a piece that was just a rehashing of the Oregonian reporting from him back in the late 80s and 90s. And this was about 7 years ago. And I had over 1,000 people come at me in the comments section claiming that he didn't know about the poisoning of the area's water supply. And so which would be a very weird dynamic for an organization like his, where he kind of had all-encompassing power in the 88 Rolls Royces and everything that he was involved with. So it still brings to question of, have you seen any, like, all of these ideas make sense, but have you seen these actually played out in practice?
I mean, your point about the folks that are playing it straight don't get a lot of airtime is really true. Like, I think it's critical for folks to realize that, like, wisdom, like truly authentic wisdom, has been completely captured in the spiritual marketplace. So now if you're judging a yogi on their number of Instagram followers, it's actually probably much more about what their ass looks like in a pair of Lululemons, right, than their dedication to an 8-limbed path. And the same with personal growth and inspiration, companies, organizations, personalities, right? That sense of like, oh, they must be legit. Look how many tens or hundreds of thousands of people are following this thing, is completely upside down. So, and that is a real challenge, right? Because most of the tools for gaining and in boosting signal these days are, nakedly transactional, narcissistic, and cynical. And even 10 years ago, but for sure 20, 30, 50 years ago, the kinds of behaviors that self-promoters are using to promote would have had you drummed out of any community of practice, ridiculed, and shamed. And now they're table stakes to even break through the noise. And so, my sense is that there are a handful. I'm always trying, because people always ask me this, because I spend a chunk of time deconstructing the ones that are wrong, right? They're like, give us a sign. And I haven't yet heard anything bad about Adyashanti. I, for a long time, kind of had Chogyam Trungpa as one of my crazy wisdom, but generally badass dudes. And then that recent expose in Walrus came out that broke my heart, that there was, so much abuse in that system and so much impact on the kids that had been raised there. And, all that I was like, oh, the wheels went off with his successor, but he was more or less wild but clean. And I was like, fuck, I have to downgrade that one. Pema Chodron's experience. Pema is another one that I've always kind of held on, to a clean light, just bringing through her stuff and obviously her affiliation with that whole community. You're like, well, what'd you think of it and what'd you make of it? And I know there was an interview with her and Shambhala, I think back in the 90s, where I'm assuming it was a woman interviewing her who constantly tried to get her to basically slag off Trungpa. And she's kind of like, look, I knew he was wild and dangerous. That's why I wanted to go study with him. That's why he was valuable. And I think, aside from the prudish moralizing, there is a role for the mad, bad, and dangerous to know, right? Like the true crazy wisdom teachers. But on the flip side, I'm not aware of any people who have self-identified or later been categorized as crazy wisdom teachers, meaning kind of left-hand path, like all things are permitted. We're going to push the limits and the boundaries. We're going to use that as fuel to accelerate our development or you getting it. I haven't seen any of those folks necessarily pull it off. It seems like such a volatile and unstable element, and when you shake it a bunch, at some point it goes nuclear.
And especially what you're prescribing too, I feel has a sense of community. I mean, my best friends, my closest people in my life, my wife, my closest friends, my family, they're so close to me because they keep me in check. Yeah. And I am constantly calling people out. And that's how I know how I filter friends, because I will just say what's on my mind, and that's not for everyone. Mm-hmm. So that communal sense of like, hey, let's take it down a notch here and let's look at this is so important. And I agree with you that like that would like putting the leader to wash dishes is a great idea, but especially now, when we've seen the first real global indoctrination into a cult via QAnon, and there aren't as many opportunities for the actual physical spaces. How do these ideas that you have translate into the digital spaces? Have you thought about how, like, the ways that they're manipulated through social media, or the abuses of power that can happen through the platforms that we communicate on?
Yeah, funny you should ask that. We're actually, okay. We're actually, you didn't hear it here, but we're launching an alternate reality game, but actually the infinite game. So the infinite alternate reality game, which will be YAnon to Culture Jam QAnon, and then to basically engage in the act of, you can't beat a ripping yarn with a better Wikipedia page, right? So debunking QAnon, right, will never work, because people are yearning for a grand explanatory meta-narrative that addresses their concerns, that recenters them in their own heroic unfolding, right? And gives them a promised utopian destination to hurry to, right? And so we've even got friends who are working on this, on some badass projects for organizing information ecology, providing better meta-news analysis, all this kind of stuff. And God bless them, I hope it works, but I wouldn't bank on it. Right, and I wouldn't bank on it for that reason. It's bringing a spoon to a gunfight. You're like, but check out the footnotes. Like clearly, QAnon is not an evidence-based phenomenon, and so in the same way that there's I think been effective critiques of basically what that term stochastic terrorism, where Bin Laden back in the day or Trump kind of lately will get on a public media platform and say, this is terrible and they're to blame and someone really ought to do something. And then El Paso Walmart happens and they're like, who'd have known it? Lone crazy. That's stochastic terrorism, right? You kind of incenting a thing that you then kind of try to plausibly deny had causality to you. And so by launching an infinite ARG, an alternate reality game, we can engage in stochastic Gnosticism, which is like, we didn't say blow yourself to God consciousness and come back as a human in bodhisattvic service to the rest of humanity, but we did just show you how. And we did it in the form of this, again, postmodern, infinite game, fictional, exploratory, Gnostic metaverse. And if you look at a lot of the alternate reality games that have come up, most of them have been backed by a company trying to launch a product. right? So that one of the most famous was Halo 2, and it was like this I Love Bees game. There were others like Cicada 3301 that kind of even showed up in Assassin's Creed. It showed up in video games. It crossed boundaries and platforms, and all of them have this consistently Gnostic plot where like reality is not as you think. We're going to expand it. We're going to show you the secrets behind the secrets. Come along. But then they almost all end like a Christmas story, with the Roy Roger decoder ring, like drink more Ovaltine. What the fuck? Like I thought I was part of a secret agent gang and I was listening to my radio to get the thing. And all it told me was to go buy more of that goddamn chocolate milk powder. And so our intention was like, oh, if you were going to launch a disruptive postmodern religion in hyperspace, what would it look like? And I think that an infinite ARG is about as close as my working assessment is for now, which would be a relief because I think I've taken narrative nonfiction to its absolute snapping point, right? And this provides a really, really fun, again, multimedia vehicle to take Sleep No More in New York, to take Meow Wolf in Vegas, to take Burning Man, to take, movies and books and the traditions, be like, hey, psst, there's this ripping yarn and we've all been missing it. But you can connect those dots. I mean, that's a fuck ton more interesting than Q drops.
Sleep No More as a religion could be quite interesting. I agree with that.
Yeah, right. I mean, think about it, right? I mean, we can even go as far as saying, hey, because Sleep No More, the box, there's all sorts of like edgy exploratory theater. Meow Wolf has done the same for art museums, right? They're all kicking down the fourth wall. They're saying, hey, you're not just a passive audience, member of an audience watching a performance in a curated, boundary. It's all interpermeable. But I think we can go even further and actually kick down the fifth wall, because you can be like, hey, part of the clues are like, hey, here's this private YouTube link to a playlist that's 45-minute long with, Android Jones visuals and, start here. Here's the breathing protocol you found somewhere else. Here's a QR code you found on your telephone pole. Put them all together. See you at 6, do this in this order, do these things together, have that experience. And we're actually going to continue the narrative based on the interiority of the experience you just had in a non-ordinary state, right? So then you can literally done well. I mean, execution and timing is everything. But if you done well, like truly transformative ARGs could basically disrupt the entire gaming industry plus the movie industry, as far as like high stakes, truly visceral transformation economy play. And that would be way more fun than a church with a fucking preacher. With a diamond earring and shoe game, you're like, let's get beyond that as fast as we can.
Well, I know that some investors in Los Angeles have taken over space at the Westfield Century City Mall because they believe that the movie theater is going the way of the dinosaur, and they're investing in, actual spaces for, a larger physical space to facilitate what you're talking about. And they're kind of going all in on that, which is very interesting. But the last question I want to ask, though, it goes along those lines, though, is one of access. You talk about like even things of such like, I have my Oculus right here, and the sense of presence is incredible, and it's only going to get better. You talk a lot about biohacking, but at the moment, I mean, optimization tools are still very expensive, and you have vast inequalities between a lot of the people that can enjoy the fruits of the wellness industry and partake in it as compared to a broader population. And so you have this very limited privileged sect that can really dive into everything in wellness as presented, at least in terms of marketed, not some of the basic practices. Yeah. And you have zero class solidarity going along those lines. So if you want to actually implement this on a broader scale, how do you deal with that dichotomy of the income disparities that exist in our culture right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's central, right? Because boutique, high cost, low serving population solutions are everywhere. And, that was kind of the premise of the middle of the book, which was like if IDEO, the design firm, was trying and solve the meaning crisis, right? We had this collapsed in shared reality and what's it all for. At the same time that we're having, increasingly wild and consequential world events, right? The idea was that it had to be open source, scalable, and anti-fragile. And open source meant anybody had access to it. There weren't priests or gatekeepers telling you orthodoxies, what you can and can't do with these tools. It had to be scalable, which speaks directly to your point, which means that basically to scale to the bottom 4 billion humans on this planet, it's got to be cheap, really cheap, or outright free. And then anti-fragile means it can't be too precious. It can't require 10 days in sitting in silence following my nostril breaths of Vipassana. It can't require some esoteric toad venom from Sonora. It can't require, right, really unique and hard to recreate ideal conditions. And as a result, that's what led me in the research to be like, okay, well, we've got to focus as close to evolutionary drivers as possible. That's the strongest stuff we've got to play with. And if we can learn to interact with and modify those inputs and their outputs, we've got a chance, which led to kind of the identification of those big 5, which was respiration, because we've all got to breathe, and changing how we breathe changes our neurophysiology and our experience. So super powerful, and everyone can do it without spending a dime. Sexuality, for all the reasons we've talked about, it's this, it is literally how we all got here. It creates a ton of pain and heartache, misused and abused, but reappropriated can do profound things. Our embodiment, and that's everything from movement, functional movement, fascia, sliding surfaces, palpation, opening up all the way to deeper dive elements like some of our core regulatory systems. Music, as profound and even more ancient than actually spoken language. So you're like, holy smokes, that's awesome. And then intentional, appropriately timed and deployed substances. And Ron Siegel at UCLA even called our desire to seek altered states is our 4th evolutionary drive. It's that strong. It shows up across the animal kingdom. So you're like, okay, so if we're playing with those are literally everyone's birthright, and they don't cost any money. And in fact, one of our core recommendations when we playfully replace the 10 commandments with 10 suggestions, and the very first suggestion is just do the obvious. Get outside, like sleep more, move often, eat cleanly, make love, be grateful, get outside, grieve fully, like those are the basics, and they don't require anybody's biohacking, auto debit to get set up. And so that would be our hope, is that not that there's a singular way to do any of this stuff, or that you have to use all the elements. It's just, this is our cultural toolkit. And then really encourage and hopefully inspire 1,000, 10,000, 1 million micro experiments by people, starting with partners, expanding into a close circle of friends. And that's actually another piece of how do you prevent the leader from getting corrupted? I think Tolkien had it right. Like the One Ring will corrupt everyone no matter what, right? So build a fellowship that can hold that kind of power and potential, right? Be like Gandalf and Galadriel. Like Galadriel, just that famous in the movie, like the Cate Blanchett character, the Elven Queen. She grabs and she turns into like Black Kali, and she's like, yeah! And she's like, and I don't need this, and thank you, I'm out. And the same with Gandalf, right? So the capacity for us to take our dyads and expand them to dozens, and take our dozens and connect them to a dozen dozens, and that gets you to the Dunbar realm, 144, 150, right? You're right there. You're like, that's a pretty good cohort. And then let's revive. I mean, I think in some respects, people on the progressive humanitarian side of things are like, oh, what we need is this push to a global centric consciousness, right? We need everybody to kind of level up. And, if I was just a cynical historian, for instance, I would say, hey, man, we had a good run at that. That was the last 50 years, friends. If we didn't pull it off in the optimal conditions coming out of World War II until now, we're not pulling it off coming soon. And actually, I would make a case that what we need is actually right now. I mean, like, yes, I agree with that, but I think we're out of time. And I think what we actually need right now is to self-arrest. Like, how do we stop ourselves sliding down the mountain? And that is actually, how do we regress into healthy tribalism? Because we're seeing all sorts of unhealthy tribalism on both the far left and the far right, right? Lots of ethno-tribalism. Like, this is our people and we deserve what's coming to us and they don't. But we need healthy tribalism. And I think the only healthy tribalism I'm aware of is community. So, like, let's get to know our neighbors again. let's double down on friends and family, and let's start taking responsibility for the people that we know and know us, and invite everybody into the project. So that would be my hope, is that the toolkit is open source, it is accessible, cheap or free, and that we don't know which one of these or which 1,000 of these is going to work. But we do know that if we unleash human creativity and community and connection, supported by inspiration and healing, that there's a better chance that we're going to innovate and mutate things that work. And once somebody gets it right for that space or place or time, other people can imitate. And then hopefully we can find ways to stitch this whole thing back together.